the spring of 1994, the entire township of Vermilion County, Alberta, not laughed at Josephine Lacroix. They laughed at the co-op elevator in Kitscoty. They laughed across the counter at the Husky station on the highway. They laughed in the parking lot of the United Church after the Sunday potluck. They laughed at the grain auction in Lloydminster, 22 miles west, where a man with a coffee in each hand told the story to 3 other men who had never met Josephine and laughed anyway. The widow Lacroix had driven down to a farm equipment sale in Wainwright and come home not with a newer grain auger or a replacement header, but with 400 bare-root seedlings of Siberian elm and Manitoba maple wrapped in wet burlap in the back of her half-ton. She was going to plant every one of them in her barley fields, not along the shelter belt, not along the fence rows, in the actual fields. Between the rows of crop, the people of Vermilion County had a word for it: grief. Everyone knew that Louis Lacroix had died the previous November, 51 years old. A stroke, sudden, while he was greasing the combine in the shop. He had left the farm to his wife, and now the wife was planting trees in the middle of working cropland. The county laughed for 3 months. Then it laughed for 5 more years. It stopped laughing in the summer of 2000, when the longest stretch of dry heat in half a century moved across the Peace Country and northern Alberta. And stayed. When farmers in 4 surrounding counties started selling grain bins empty and livestock they couldn't feed. When someone driving the gravel road past Josephine Lacroix's quarter sections noticed something that didn't make sense. Her fields were still producing, not bumper yields, not spectacular, but producing. The soil under and around her trees held moisture that the open fields 3 miles away had lost by June. The county stopped laughing that summer. It didn't say much else either. Let me take you back 6 years. Let me show you what she planted. Let me show you who laughed. At the farm sale in Wainwright. On that Friday in April of 1994, a man named Stephen Hoare had his seedlings laid out on a tarpaulin near the east fence of the auction yard, roots wrapped and labeled, each bundle tied with orange binder twine. He had been there since 7 in the morning. By 10 o'clock, clot, not a single person had asked him the price. Stephen Hoare had come to Alberta from the province of Saskatchewan in 1981 with a half-ton truck, a borrowed planting bar, and more opinions about shelter belts than anyone in his new county wanted to hear. He had spent 13 years trying to convince Alberta grain farmers to plant trees not just on the edges of their land, but inside it. He had sold a few hundred seedlings, here and there, to people who wanted a windbreak by the house, a hedge along the driveway. He had never sold to someone who wanted to put trees between crop rows on working land. That morning in Wainwright, he had decided quietly that this would be his last sale. He was going to sell off the remaining stock, return the tarpaulin to his brother-in-law, and stop propagating entirely. 13 years was too long to keep carrying a thing nobody wanted to carry with you. Josephine Lacroix stopped in front of his tarpaulin at 10 past 10. She asked 4 questions. He answered them. She wrote him a check for $240, 60 cents per seedling, and loaded all 400 in for half-ton between 2 layers of wet burlap between 2 layers of wet burlap. She drove them 81 kilometers back to the farm outside Kitscoty. Within 48 hours, Vermilion County had a new story to tell. Joe Lacroix bought 400 trees to put in her crop fields. Understand what the seedlings looked like in April of 1994. They were thin as a pencil, some of them thinner. Most were 50 to 60 centimeters tall, a few reaching 70. Their roots were bare and pale, white and cream-colored, with fine lateral roots that had been trimmed back for transport. When you held them up in the light, they looked like something a greenhouse would throw away. They did not look like anything that belonged between rows of barley in a working Alberta field. They looked like something that belonged in a municipal park. Something a city would plant beside a bike path. Something decorative. Something for someone who had never had to account for yield loss per seeded acre. Every grain farmer in Vermilion County knew exactly what trees did to a crop field. They shaded out yield. They competed for moisture. They were the thing you spent money every few years to keep from encroaching. Trees were what you removed. They were not what you planted. This was as settled a fact as the direction of the weather. Stephen Hoare himself nearly tried to talk her out of it. He said to her, standing at the tailgate of her half-ton in the auction yard, that she should understand what she was committing to. The trees would take 3 to 5 years to establish. They would shade a strip of crop on either side of each row. They were not a quick return. Josephine looked at the seedlings in the box of the truck. "You want all 400 in the fields?" he asked. "Not along the fence line. In the fields, spaced out, not in rows of trees, in rows between the crop." Stephen studied her for a moment. He had been trying to sell these trees for 13 years. He had talked himself dry in front of groups of farmers who nodded politely and walked away. He had never stood at a tailgate with someone who already understood the layout before she had asked the price. He said, "I need to be straight with you. I don't want your money if you don't understand what you're giving up in yield per acre for the first few years." Josephine folded the check into his shirt pocket, the same way a person puts a letter in a mailbox. "Final. No question about it. Mr. Hoare," she said. "I know what I'm giving up. I also know what I'm buying." Her brother-in-law Marcel was at the auction that day. He had driven down with her that morning and spent the first 2 hours at the equipment lots. He came back while Stephen was tying down the burlap over the seedlings. He looked at the load. He looked at Josephine. He looked at Stephen. He looked back at the load. "Joe," he said. "What in the world are you doing?" "Buying trees," she said. "For the fields. For the fields." Marcel was 58. He had been farming in Vermilion County his entire life, dry land grain on 700 acres east of Lloydminster, the same land his father had broken in the 1940s. He was Louis's older brother, and since Louis had died the previous November, Marcel had been driving out to the farm every Thursday, whether Josephine asked him to or not, to check the bins, to check the equipment, to check on her. He took his cap off. "Joe," he said, "you're going to shade out your yield. You know what a tree does to a grain field." "I know exactly what a tree does to a grain field." "Then why?" "I'll explain it to you in 7 years, Marcel." Marcel looked at Stephen Hoare, who was watching this exchange without expression. He looked at the 400 bare root trees in the box of his sister-in-law's truck. He looked at the ground for a moment. Louis would never have done this. "Louis isn't here to do it," Josephine said. "And I am." The story reached the co-op elevator in Kitscoty by Tuesday morning. Joe Lacroix bought 400 trees at the Wainwright sale, going to plant them in her barley fields, every single one. It was at the Husky station on the highway by Wednesday afternoon. By Thursday, it had made it to the grain auction in Lloydminster, where a man named Gary Pelletier heard it while he was waiting on a bid for a load of durum. Gary had farmed beside Louis Lacroix for 19 years. He didn't laugh when he heard the story. He just shook his head and said to no one in particular, "Louis isn't even cold, and she's planting trees in the barley." By Friday, it was at the coffee counter of the Diner in Kitscoty and the United Church, parking lot after the Sunday potluck and the morning table, at the back of the Lloydminster Co-op Cafe. where 4 older farmers sat every weekday at 7:30 and talked about commodity prices and what the weather was or wasn't doing. At that table, a man named Earl Wicks delivered what the county understood to be the final verdict. "She's grieving," Earl said. "That's all this is. Louis has been gone since November, and now she's lost her judgment. There'll be an auction out there by fall. Watch." The other 3 men nodded. They had seen this kind of thing before. A widow making strange decisions about land she had inherited but had not grown up farming. It was sad, but it followed a pattern they all recognized. In 6 months, someone from the county would buy the quarter sections. The crop would go to whoever leased the land. The trees, if they had survived the spring, would be disked under. This was the story Vermilion County settled on. A widow, 43 years old, trying to run her dead husband's farm, making a decision that even the man who sold her the trees had tried to talk her out of. A woman planting trees in a crop field. The county repeated the story the way small counties repeat things. At every elevator, at every fence line conversation, at every community supper for 3 months. Josephine heard about it, of course. There was no way not to. She said nothing. She planted the trees. If you have ever watched a community underestimate someone for reasons that had nothing to do with their actual knowledge, stay with me. Because what Josephine Lacroix built over the next 6 years is the kind of story that only makes sense told from the beginning, and what nobody saw coming is still waiting. Let me tell you where she came from. Because nothing she did next makes sense unless you understand that. Josephine was born Josephine Girard in 1951 in Bonneville, Alberta. Her father, René Girard, had farmed dryland grain in the Bonneville district since 1938. Her mother, Colette, ran the books on the farm and taught school 3 days a week in the district school 7 kilometers down a gravel road. Josephine grew up the second of 4 children. She could drive the grain truck at 11. She could read a soil test at 14. She kept the farm's financial ledgers from the age of 16. Because Colette had an absolute conviction that a woman who couldn't read a balance sheet was a woman who would always need someone else to read it for her. In 1972, when Josephine was 21, René took her to a conference in Saskatoon, put on by the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration. It was supposed to be about soil conservation. Most of the farmers who attended left after the first day, because the second day's sessions were about agroforestry, which, in 1972, most prairie grain farmers associated with either the government telling them what to do or with people who didn't understand real farming. Josephine stayed for the second day. A researcher named Dr. Alma Fenchurch from the University of Manitoba gave a 2-hour presentation on what she called integrated tree crop systems. She had data from trials in Manitoba and from research stations in the Soviet grain belt and in the dryland wheat zones of Spain. The numbers were clear. Fields with deliberately planted tree rows, spaced at intervals across the crop area, showed lower wind erosion, measurably higher soil moisture in dry years, and in some configurations showed yield improvement in drought years, because the soil under the influence of the tree rows retained moisture that open fields lost to evaporation and wind. The effect was not dramatic in wet years. In dry years, it was the difference between a partial crop and no crop. Josephine wrote it all down in a stenographer's notebook she had bought at a drugstore in Saskatoon the night before. She went back to the farm in Bonneville in March and asked her father why nobody did this on the prairies. René told her the truth. Prairie farmers clear trees. They have spent 100 years clearing trees to make cropland, asking them to put Trees back in the cropland is asking them to undo the thing their fathers and grandfathers spent their whole lives doing. You could show them the numbers. They'd still think you were wrong. Some things a person believes with the body, not the mind. Josephine kept the notebook. She married Louis Lacroix in 1975 when she was 24. Louis farmed 640 acres outside Kitscoty, the same land his family had held since 1929. Barley, canola, a bit of wheat, good black soil, no trees except along the creek bottom and the original shelter belt on the north side of the farmyard. Josephine brought the notebook with her. She showed it to Louis once in 1979. He read it carefully. He put it down. He said, "Joe, if I plant trees in the barley fields, your father-in-law will think I've lost my mind. And he'll be right here to say so." She put the notebook in the bottom drawer of the desk, in the farm office. She did not bring it up again for 15 years. Louis died on November 9, 1993, of a stroke. He was 51 years old. He left Josephine the farm, the equipment, an operating loan with 2 years left on it, a savings account with $22,000, and the desk with the notebook still in the bottom drawer. Josephine was 42 years old. They had 2 children, both grown. Her daughter, Renee, was living in Edmonton, working as a hospital administrator. Her son, Thierry, was in Saskatoon in his 2nd year of an agriculture degree at the university. She spent 1993 getting through November and December. She spent the early months of 1994 reading every paper on shelter belts and agroforestry that the Alberta Agriculture Extension Office could locate for her. She spent 2 weekends in Edmonton at the university library, where Thierry met her both times and sat beside her at the photocopier while she copied research papers from Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and from a long-term trial in the dryland zones of Castile in Spain. She placed the call to Stephen Hoare in February. She drove to the sale in April. Here is what Vermilion County did not know. Josephine had been planning this since the winter of 1993, 6 weeks after Louis died, when she had driven to Edmonton alone on a Tuesday morning and made an appointment she had not told anyone about. She had driven to the University of Alberta's Faculty of Agriculture and Resource Economics and spent 4 hours with a soil scientist named Dr. Paulette Cormier, a woman from New Brunswick who had spent a decade studying what she called windbreak integration in prairie grain systems. Josephine brought Renee's stenographer's notebook from 1972. She brought the photocopied research papers. She brought her own farm's soil survey, her yield records from the past 12 years sorted by field, her moisture readings, her fertilizer inputs, her operating costs. Dr. Cormier told her 3 things. First, her soil type, a heavy black loam over a clay subsoil, was almost ideal for what she was describing. The clay subsoil would hold moisture under a tree canopy at a depth that crop roots could access in a dry year. Second, the species question mattered more than people understood. Siberian elm and Manitoba maple were not her first choice for yield integration, but they were cold-hardy to Zone 2, fast establishing, and their root systems did not acidify the soil. Third, the spacing she was considering, rows of trees every 200 meters across the field, with a spacing of 30 to 40 meters between individual trees within each row, would reduce her seeded area by less than 4%, while creating a moisture-influence zone that could affect up to 30% of the remaining crop in a dry year. She gave Josephine Stephen Hoare's name. She told her he had been trying to sell these trees for years. Before Josephine left, Dr. Cormier said one more thing. "Mrs. Lacroix," she said, "the question is not what the trees do for your yields in a good moisture year. In a good year, the effect is marginal. The question is what happens in the year the rain doesn't come and the wind does. That is when you will know whether you built it right. Josephine wrote that down too. She spent the rest of the winter designing the planting layout. She was not going to plant in shelter belt rows along the edges. She was going to plant in a pattern she had seen diagrammed in the 1972 research. Rows running perpendicular to the prevailing northwest wind, spaced across 4 of her 8 cultivated quarter sections, the ones with the most exposure and the lightest topsoil. 400 trees across approximately 240 cultivatable acres. Less than 2 trees per acre. The fields would still be fields. The crop would still be the entire purpose of the land. But in 5 to 7 years, the trees would be tall enough and dense enough in each row to begin breaking the wind at the soil surface and shading the ground beside them during the hottest hours of a dry day. She worked out the geometry on graph paper on Lewis's side of the desk. Each quarter section mapped out, each proposed tree location marked, the prevailing wind direction noted in pencil at the top of each page, the moisture influence zones projected forward 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. July. She did this work alone in the office in the evenings of Gone Through Day's farm work, after she had called Renee or answered a letter from Thierry, after the farmyard was quiet and the only sound was the furnace cycling on against the February cold. That is why nobody in Vermilion County understood the purchase. They were seeing a widow buying ornamental trees for cropland. They were watching a woman execute a plan she had been building for 4 months. She started planting on the morning of April 28, 1994. She had the 400 seedlings in the box of the half-ton, still in their burlap. She had a planting bar. She had a 5-gallon pail of water in the cab to moisten the roots as she went. She had 400 short wooden lath stakes she had cut in the shop the previous weekend. She had the graph paper maps. She started in the north quarter first, 80 acres of black soil that had been in barley for 6 of the last 8 years, the most exposed field on the property, the one that lost topsoil in a northwest wind that the neighboring fields didn't. She paced off the first distance from the north fence, 64 meters. She drove a stake. She made the first hole with the planting bar. The soil was cold, still wet from snowmelt. The bar went in easily. The first seedling went in. She packed the soil around it with her boot. She moved to the next stake position. She planted 22 seedlings the first day. She was cold by 2 in the afternoon. Her hands inside her leather work gloves were stiff by 3. She looked at the 22 small stakes in the field and understood that if she planted at this rate, she would not finish before seeding season, and then she would lose the window. She would be planting trees in a field that needed to be seeded, and one of those 2 things would be wrong. That evening she pulled Lewis's tractor-mounted transplanter out of the machine shed. It was a 2-row potato planter adapted for tree seedlings, something Louis had bought at an estate sale in 1988 and used twice before storing it. The hydraulic lines had dried out. 2 of the press wheels were seized. She spent the next 2 evenings in the shop with the hydraulic fittings and a torch, Lewis's service manual open on the bench beside her. Let me tell you about that shop, because the shop is where this story actually lived. Lewis's shop was a 1970s pole building on a concrete pad, tin walls, fluorescent lights on chains. The workbench along the north wall had been built by his father Gustav in 1961 out of 2-inch fir planks that had come from a granary they tore down that spring. A post vise was bolted to the west corner of the bench. Gustav had bought it at a farm sale in Lloydminster in 1957. It had been in daily use for 37 years by the time Josephine walked in alone on a cold April evening in 1994. She had not used the shop much since Louis died. She had hired a neighbor's son named Kevin to come out and do the mechanical work she couldn't handle through the winter. But she had watched Louis work in that shop for 19 years, and Louis had learned from Gustave Ave, who had been a better machinist than he admitted. Between the two of them, she had absorbed more than she ever consciously tried to. She fixed the hydraulic lines. She freed the press wheels. She mounted the transplanter on the tractor and ran it empty across the yard to check the spacing and the depth. It worked. She planted 61 seedlings the second day. By the end of the first week, she had over 200 in the ground. By the end of the second week, all 400 were planted. She recorded everyone in a new notebook. She used the quarter-section boundaries as reference points, drew each field on its own page, each tree a numbered dot, each dot linked to a line in the ledger recording the date planted, the species, the height at planting, the row it belonged to. Total cost of the planting, $310 for the seedlings and her own labor for 2 weeks. She had spent 2 weeks of her own time and $310 on a system that her brother-in-law had told her was going to cost her yield for the rest of her farming life. By the end of June 1994, 53 of the seedlings were dead. A 13% loss, higher than she had expected, mostly from late frost damage to the new growth and from soil heaving in the fields that had still been freezing and thawing in May. She replaced them the following spring. Stephen Hoare drove them out himself, all 53 replacements, at no charge. Because no one had ever ordered 400 trees from him at once, and the ones she had planted were, now, as best as he could determine, the largest single integrated agroforestry planting on private farmland in Alberta. Marcel drove out to the farm on a Thursday evening in July. He sat in the kitchen and drank coffee and did not say what he had come to say for the first 20 minutes. Then he said it. "Joe, I drove the north quarter today. Those trees don't look like much." "Some didn't make it," she said. "I'm replacing them next spring." Marcel, he set his cup down. He rubbed his face. He had been Louis's brother for 57 years and Josephine's brother-in-law for 19, and he was not a man who found this kind of thing easy to say. He said, "Joe, I told Louis when he married you that his wife was the sharper of the two of them. I'm telling you that now because I think it's still true. And I think you're running yourself into the ground for something that Louis would have found a way to talk you out of." "I'm not running myself into the ground." "Then what are you doing?" "I'm planting trees." He looked at her for a long moment. "You are one stubborn woman, Josephine." "I am," she said. He drove away. He did not come back for 8 months. That night, Josephine sat at Louis's desk with the original 1972 notebook open to the page where she had written down Alma Fenchurch's numbers. The data was clear. The system worked. It had worked in Manitoba. It had worked in Spain. It had worked in the Soviet trial plots. She was not wrong. She was only in month 3 of a 7-year plan. She closed the notebook. She went to bed. She was back in the North Quarter before 7 the next morning. By the summer of 1995, the surviving seedlings were averaging 90 centimeters tall. By 1996, 180. By 1997, nearly 3 meters, with lateral branches beginning to spread. Josephine had stopped supplemental watering after the first full season. The trees' root systems had found the clay subsoil moisture her crop roots couldn't access. They were drawing water from 2, 3, 4 meters down. Their leaf litter was building in a mat around each tree base. She took soil samples at the tree bases and between trees twice a year and sent them to the provincial soil lab in Edmonton. The organic matter content in the soil within 15 meters of the tree rows was measurably higher than in the open field centers by 1997. The moisture retention difference in the same samples, taken after a 2-week dry stretch, was more pronounced than she had projected. In the fall of 1997, she compared her barley yields against her own records from the previous 6 years, field by field. The open fields were flat. The fields with the tree rows were showing a small improvement in the zones closest to the tree rows. Not dramatic, but measurable. 3 to 5 bushels per acre in the influenced zone, in a year with normal rainfall. She wrote it down. She did not tell anyone. Vermilion County did not see any of this. They saw a widow with trees in her crop fields. They saw a farm that looked different from every other farm on the road. A few of the neighbors noticed that her canola in 1998 had graded well at the elevator. Most of them were too busy watching the weather. By the spring of 1999, the stock tanks in the grazing leases to the south were lower than normal. The winter had been dry. The spring was dry. By June of 1999, the old-timers at the morning table in Lloydminster were saying quietly to each other, "This one could go long." The drought of 2000 did not arrive as a single catastrophe. It arrived as an absence. A dry September in 1999. A winter with 40% of normal snowpack. A spring with 1/3 of the usual April rain. By May, the topsoil across Vermilion County was already pulling away from itself at the edges. The fine cracks that told you what was underneath was not going to be enough. By June, the crops were 4 to 6 inches shorter than they should have been, and already showing stress color, that blue-gray tinge on a canola crop, the rolled leaf on a barley crop. That means the plant has stopped growing and started waiting. The elevators in Kitscoty and Lloydminster were doing a quiet, terrible business. Farmers were selling early, selling light, selling whatever they had in the bin from 1999 because the 2000 crop was not going to be worth waiting for. A man named Doug Farquhar, west of Kitscoty, sold his entire 1999 canola carryover in June at a price that didn't cover his input costs, because he needed the bin space in the cash and because his 2000 crop was already a partial write-off by July. Earl Wicks, who had been the man to deliver the definitive verdict on Josephine Lacroix in 1994, was in the worst position of anyone on the road. He was 68. He farmed 500 acres. His topsoil on the west fields, always his most exposed land, had been blowing since May. By July, he was hauling water to his cattle because the dugout was low and his creek had reduced to a trickle in the heat. He sold 30 head in August at a loss he did not want to calculate out loud. He was looking at a crop insurance claim that would cover 60 cents on the dollar of a bad year. By August, he was telling his son quietly that they might have to look at renting the land out next year. He had never said that before. The land had been in his family since 1947. Then one morning in late August, Earl Wicks was driving back from the elevator in Kitscoty on the gravel road that ran past Josephine Lacroix's North Quarter. He had driven that road probably 5,000 times in his life. He had never once stopped to look at her farm. He stopped that morning, because what he saw on the other side of her fence was not what the rest of Vermilion County looked like in August of 2000. Her barley was short. Make no mistake about it, it was a drought year in her fields, the same as everywhere else. But it was standing. It had heads. The color in the zone closest to the tree rows, which by now were 3.5 to 4 meters tall, was visibly different from the color in the open field center. The soil at the base of the tree rows was darker. It held moisture you could see in the color of it. Her crop was not a miracle, but it was a crop. It was not the blue-gray waiting to die color that his own west fields had turned in June. Earl Wicks got out of his truck. He walked to her fence. He stood there for a long time. He looked at the trees, which were straight and full now, unmistakably healthy, not ornamental in any sense of the word, functional, the way a windbreak is functional. He looked at the soil under and between the tree rows. He looked at the crop in the zones adjacent to the trees. He looked at his own forearm, which was already sweating in the 9 o'clock heat. And he looked at the shadow the trees cast across the soil. At that hour, a broken, partial shade that reduced the surface temperature by enough that you could feel it standing at the fence. He understood something that he did not want to understand. He drove back to his own farm. He stood at the edge of his west field, the worst one. The soil had a crust. The crop was thin and uneven. There was no shade. There was nothing between his topsoil and the northwest wind except distance. He got back in his truck. He drove back to the road in front of Josephine Lacroix's north quarter. He parked on the gravel. He sat there for a long time. He did not go to her door. He did not honk. He sat in the truck and looked at what she had built over 6 years while the county had been laughing. After a while, he drove away. Josephine saw his truck from the kitchen window. She recognized it. She did not go out. She watched him drive away, and then she poured herself another cup of coffee and went back to her desk. By the middle of September of 2000, word was moving through Vermilion County, the way word moves in a small county when it doesn't want to be heard. Farmers were driving the road past Josephine's quarters, not stopping, mostly, just slowing down. Some of them pulled onto the shoulder and looked. One morning she counted 7 trucks on the gravel road between her front gate and the road allowance. Not one of them knocked on her door. Not one of them called out. They just looked. They were looking at what they had spent 6 years dismissing. The first person to come to her door was not a neighbor. It was a woman named Sandra Okafor, the regional agrologist for the Alberta Agriculture Office in Lloydminster, who had been following Josephine's planting records for 2 years through the Extension Office's soil monitoring program. Sandra had driven out in June of 1999 to walk the fields and take notes. She had come back in May of 2000 with 2 colleagues from the Provincial Soil Conservation Unit and spent a full day taking cores and measurements. She came back on September 12, 2000. Josephine made tea. They sat at the kitchen table. Sandra was 39 years old and had spent 14 years trying to get grain farmers in northeastern Alberta interested in anything other than conventional row crop production. She had been laughed out of more producer meetings than she wanted to recall. She looked at Josephine across the table, and she said, "I don't know if you've been into town much." "Not much," Josephine said. "People are driving past, I know. Have any of them come to the door?" "Not yet." Sandra looked at her cup. She said, "Mrs. Lacroix, I think what is going to happen out of this drought is that people will finally pay attention, not because of any data I've been able to show them, because they can see your fields from the road. That is the only thing that was ever going to work." Josephine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "When it rains again, some of them will forget." Sandra nodded. "Some will. Not all." She looked at Josephine directly. "What you have built here," she said, "is going to be in the literature. I'd like your permission to bring researchers from the university." "You don't need my permission," Josephine said. "The Extension Office already has my data. Use it." Sandra brought the researchers in October. A team from the University of Alberta, 3 people over 2 days, soil samples and yield data, and a photographic survey of the tree rows. Their paper came out in the Canadian Journal of Soil Science in 2003. It became a reference paper for prairie agroforestry research. It cited Josephine's own field records extensively. She was acknowledged as the cooperating producer. She had declined co-authorship when Sandra asked, on the grounds that she was a farmer, not a researcher, and that the paper would do more good without her name on it. Marcel came back the following March. He had not been to the farm since the previous July, 8 months. He drove up on a Saturday morning. Josephine was in the north quarter, checking the tree rows for winter damage. She saw his truck come in, and she walked out to the gate. He had his cap in his hand. He did not look at her. He looked at the trees. "Joe," he said. "Marcel." He cleared his throat. "I drove past in August," he said. "I didn't stop. I know, I saw you." He was quiet for a moment. "Louis was a good farmer," he said. "He was the best farmer I knew," she said. "He wasn't always right." Marcel paused. "About everything." "No, neither were you." "No." He looked at the tree rows. "Neither was I. I've been sitting at that table at the co-op cafe for 6 years making the same joke about your trees. I owe you better than that." "It's all right." "Marcel, it's not, but thank you for saying so." He was still looking at the trees. "Louis would have come around. Give him a couple of years, but he would have come around to it. I know he would have. He died too young, Joe. He did." They stood there for a moment. "Can I walk the rows with you? You don't have to ask." He walked the rows with her for 2 hours. She showed him the soil moisture difference under the trees versus the open field center. She showed him where the leaf litter had built up over 6 winters. She showed him the yield records by field going back to 1994, the numbers she had never shown anyone, the slow, steady divergence between the protected fields and the open ones, a divergence that in 2000 had become undeniable. Marcel asked good questions. He had farmed this country his whole life. He understood soil. He understood wind. He had just never imagined the solution working the way it worked. At the end of the walk, he said, "Joe, how do I reach Stephen Hoare?" "I'll call him on Monday," she said. "How many acres are you thinking?" he told her. She put her hand briefly on his arm. "Welcome back, Marcel. I'm sorry I stayed away so long." Josephine Lacroix farmed the land outside Kitskoty for another 18 years after the drought of 2000. The farm did not expand. She never wanted more acres. She wanted better ones. By 2008, the integrated tree rows covered all 8 of her cultivated quarter sections. Her yield records in dry years diverged further from the county average every drought cycle. In the dry years of 2001 and 2002, her partial crop insurance claims were the smallest in her township. In the exceptional drought of 2009, she lost 4% of her expected yield. The township average that year was 27%. She kept every record. She kept every notebook. She kept the original stenographer's notebook from the conference in Saskatoon in 1972, the one her father had driven her to, the one she had stayed for when everyone else went home. It was lived in the bottom drawer of Lewis's desk for 32 years, and then she moved it to the top drawer, where she could reach it without bending down. Her daughter, Renee, left Edmonton in 2006 and came back to the farm. She had watched the 2000 drought from a city and understood something about what her mother had built that she had not understood before. She came back not for any one reason, but for all of them together. She learned the operation the way Josephine had learned it, in the fields and in the shop and at the desk, in the evenings. In 2012, Josephine handed the management to Renee. She kept the farmhouse. She kept the half-ton, which didn't run anymore, but which she was not prepared to sell. She kept the notebooks. In 2015, the Alberta Soil Conservation Network gave her a stewardship award. She did not attend the ceremony. She sent Renee, in her place, with a written statement that Renee read to the assembled agronomists and researchers and farmers. The statement was 3 sentences. It said, "My father drove me to a conference in Saskatoon in 1972, where a researcher showed us what trees could do in a drought. I wrote it down. I waited for the right time to plant." The room was quiet when Renee finished. Then it was not quiet. Renee's son is 12 years old. His name is Luke. He knows the tree rows on the farm, the way some children know a street they grew up on. Every gap and turn, every row. The trees his grandmother planted in 1994 that are now 8 meters tall, and whose canopy breaks the northwest wind before it crosses the topsoil on the north quarter. Last spring, Renee put Luke on the tractor for the first time, the same tractor Josephine had used to run the transplanter in April of 1994. He drove it out to the north quarter to check fence. Renee stood in the yard and watched him go. She said quietly, to the cold air and to no particular person, "The question is not what the trees do in a good year. The question is what happens in the year the rain doesn't come." The same words Dr. Cormier had said to Josephine in Edmonton in the winter of 1993. The same words Josephine had said to Renee in 2001, the year after the drought, standing in the North Quarter in October, showing her daughter the yield records field by field. The same words Renee had heard often enough that they were no longer a lesson but a fact, the way a compass bearing is a fact. The kind of thing you say not to teach, but because it is simply true. 400 bare root seedlings, a widow, a stenographer's notebook from 1972, the trees that nobody wanted on the land of the woman nobody believed until the drought came, and the county drove past her fence in silence and saw what 6 years of patience looks like from a gravel road in August.